And hello again. And this week, continuing the theme, if you like, and prompted again, always prompted by the things I found frolicking around at auction and in fairs. We're going to have a look at a couple of things about Sheffield Plate that I mentioned in some of the Sheffield Plate videos, but wasn't able to show you, which is basically the let-ins, the sweated in cartouches for engraving, and the turned over edges. And both of these things are important to know about if you're thinking about collecting Sheffield Plate, as they immediately distinguish a piece of genuine Sheffield Plate from a piece of electroplate. So they're the things, they're the things you look for, the shibboleths, if you like, of Sheffield Plate. Now, I'm going to have to bend down slightly to get this, because I bought a salver. It didn't say in the catalogue how big the salver was. They don't really come much bigger than this. And this is the sort of magnificent large object that was made in Sheffield Plate, particularly at the beginning of the 19th century, for very wealthy families. And you might think, well, that's not right, because wealthy families can afford silver. But you only have to look at the size of this bloody thing to see that if you made this out of solid silver, you are talking about maybe 120 up to 150 ounces of silver, at a point where it was still, in the 1800s and 1820s, regarded largely as a holding of currency. That changes through the 19th century, and by the end of the 19th century, people are no longer really holding their assets, their wealth, in silver plate. But at the beginning of the 19th century, yes, you could. Yes, you could be seen to having a store of 1,000 or 5,000 or even 10,000 ounces of silver in household plate to use. But even for great families, there came a point where the expense was too much. There was an expectation to have all of these things, to have meat domes and meat dishes and enormous salvers for your guests. But if you were making them entirely out of pure silver and you weren't the wealthiest person in the world, or even if you were wealthy, it hurt. It was expensive. So this is, as you can probably see, and we'll get on to the detail of it a bit later, has a fine coat of arms for a branch of the Hamilton clan, the Hamilton family, that very important Scottish family. So they weren't short of a few bob or two, and nor is it an instance of Scottish thrift, if the more unkind of you were to think that. But this is simply the fact that they would have had silver. They would have had silver vessels and drinking goblets and small waiters. Most of the things they would have had will have been silver. But for the big things, certainly around 1800 up to about 1830, 1840, it became acceptable to have the big things, or some of the big things, made in Sheffield Plate as an alternative. You will often see wine coolers in Sheffield Plate. Well, they're very functional objects. They don't tend to vary in design enormously, but if you make them out of silver, solid silver, they take an enormous weight of silver. Those are often made in Sheffield Plate, even for the best families. Large salvers like this, and this is, I haven't measured it, this is a whopper. If I stand it up, you'll get some idea. It dwarfs me, and believe me, that takes some doing. But these were not individual items. These were supplied in suites of salvers. So this may not even have been the largest. It's probably the largest or second largest. And then they would run in graduated series. So you might have a run of 8 or 12 or 15 of these. And of course, if you're making those out of solid silver, it is costing a fortune. Sheffield Plate is still expensive when it's made at this time. It isn't like having a plastic substitute for something. The amount of work in this is the same, if not more, as the amount of work in a silver example. The only difference is that the actual material cost of it is substantially less, because most of this is copper. Now, You can see some of the copper on the decoration here showing through in these sort of slightly reddier patches, but it retains most of its original plate. And you'll see that the centre of this, the centre reserve, that's got all of its original plating on it. But if I breathe on it, so I'll tilt it up for a minute to breathe, you'll be able to see there is actually an area or a patch around this that is a different colour when you breathe on it to the rest of it. And that's, in some light, that's fairly obvious. But if I turn it to the side, I can see it from here with my naked eye as a slightly cleaner, brighter area around there. And that's because it's pure silver. It's a small disc in this case, often on tureens, vegetable tureens, or meat domes in Sheffield plate. It won't be a circle, it will be a rectangle, but you get this reserve of pure silver that is fused on to the piece. It's added on and then hammered flush and rolled flush, and it just gives you that thickness to engrave that coat of arms, as you can clearly see, quite successfully without going through to the copper below. That comes in at the very, very, very end of the 18th century. I've seen some pieces that you could argue were 1795, 1800 in date with these reserves on them. And then they proliferate at the beginning of the 19th century, before about 1840, when electroplate all of a sudden comes in and all the energy and effort made in Sheffield plate starts to become redundant. There's a brief period, about 5 years of changeover, but it becomes redundant. The border, which you can see, this is all stamped out in sections, because they would have put this border on all the salvers, or many of the salvers they were making. It was affordable enough to make a die, to go to the expense of making a steel die, to be able to stamp these sections out. Now, these sections here are again stamped in pure silver, or sterling silver, 925 silver. Quite thin, but stamped because of the high relief. The Sheffield plate wouldn't take it, it would start to wear. But then, to give it strength, because it's very thin and it's raised up, and if you had nothing behind it, it would squash immediately, all of that is filled in with lead. So the majority of this is a lead-filled silver border, and that is what you'll find at the end of the 18th again, and proliferating, certainly in the Regency period, when everything is much more ornate and foliate and bolder. These lead-filled borders come in, but they have a feature, and this is to cover the cut edge of this large piece of Sheffield plate. And if we flick it over, I haven't polished the back deliberately because it shows up a bit better. Can you see this sort of raised line? Almost like piped icing on the edge of a biscuit going all the way round. Well, that is pure silver from this stamping. So when this is stamped, there's a slight overhang here. And what happens is it's filled in with lead, it's applied, and as it's attached, that is simply curled over. And that conceals, on the very edge here, any sign of copper. So if you turn a piece of electroplate or Sheffield plate and you're not sure, and you start to see this edge, you can be fairly confident that it is in fact a piece of Sheffield plate. There is one small fly in the ointment with that, which is the firm of Turner Bradbury & Co, Thomas Bradbury & Co, Sheffield, made reproductions of Sheffield plate in electroplate in the 1920s, and so good were they that they often or sometimes reproduced this raised edge. The only difference will be it will not be in silver, it will be a raised edge that's been stamped actually onto the border and then electroplated. So you would see, if you, I never like people filing things at all. You should never have to file a piece of Sheffield plate once you become accustomed to it. But theoretically, if you did, on one of these 1920s reproductions, you would begin to see copper on that raised edge, whereas this is pure silver. The whole border is thin, very thin, but pure silver, backfilled with lead. The lettings are only on period pieces. That is not reproduced. So these rubbed in or let in pieces of silver for an engraved crest or armorial, when you distinguish one of those, that is definitive of a genuine early piece of Sheffield plate. Now, the other thing, other couple of things I'd like to point out with this is, firstly, how magnificent Sheffield plate can be. And that's pretty fabulous. I mean, my God, I couldn't afford this if it was in silver. But in Sheffield plate, what a wonderful thing. And all of this decoration, which I'll bring it a bit closer so we can see it. And we've got foliate reserves. It's all in the 1800s to the 1820s. In fact, throughout the 19th century, it's always variations of flowers and foliate decoration. But you've floral sprays here. And then where you haven't got the floral sprays, on the alternating panels, you've got diaper work. And then above that, you've got more floral sprays. But then here you've got a very fine fish scale ground, and then rococo shells. Now, what's important to remember with this stuff, unlike electroplate, a lot of later Victorian electroplate, where these are stamped out, all of this decoration that you're looking at now on the field of the salver is hand chased, exactly as it would have been with a piece of silver. So this was originally produced, let in shield, you've got your stamped applied borders, you've got your shaped borders here, but this is plain. It's then put onto a large block of pitch, and pitch is what chasers use. That it's softened by heat. You apply the object and then it goes firm, and it gives you a resistance when you're hammering, so you don't hammer through or dent. It gives you a bit of pushback, if you like. And you hand chase, because you can't engrave on old Sheffield plate, as you know. Well, you sort of can, but you couldn't on a decorative scheme. So you hand chase all of this decoration. And of course, because it is hand chased, you get all the negative pushing out, the negative of the decoration on the reverse. So you can feel it. You can feel where they've pushed the metal back at the front, and you can feel that negative in reverse. And again, that isn't something you tend to get on electroplate. Maybe some very early electroplate is hand worked and then plated, but most of it is sort of commercially produced, certainly when you're getting towards the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. So there has to be an appreciation of this stuff, and it has fallen out of fashion tremendously. When I was working at Sotheby's 25 years ago, if that had come through the door, we may have been cautious and put £300 to £500 on it. We could have put as much as £500 to £800 on it, and it would have sold. You would only have paid 10% buyer's premium, of course, because it was a long time ago before buyer's premiums rose out of all recognition. But it would still make high hundreds of pounds, and maybe something like this, with its imposing size, with its fabulous armorial, which relates to an important Scottish family, you might even have been asked, for £1,000 to £1,500 for it in the shop, which is certainly what it is worth as a worked object that is over 200 years old. I won't disclose what I paid for this, but I will tell you the sale room estimate last week that it had on it, which was £20. And everybody saw it, and I bought it. And no, I didn't pay £20 for it, obviously, but I didn't pay £1,000 or £1,500 for it either, which I think shows you that this stuff has ever so slightly fallen out of, well, quite considerably fallen out of fashion. but there is an opportunity. If you want to collect wonderful bits of 200 or 300-year-old bits of silver, and you haven't got the money for that, and very few of us do, believe me, and you don't want to collect teaspoons, you want something substantial that you can use and show and just be impressive, well, there's a world of Sheffield plate out there. And there are lots of dealers with Sheffield plate that are just, they're waiting, particularly in London, for somebody to come into the shop and buy it again and get back to the good old days. But if things like this can turn up at auction and be estimated at £20 to £40, it will never be any cheaper. So now I would suggest is the time to go out and buy it. But don't bid against me. It's always, this is what always happens. I always give you this valuable advice, and then somebody message me a week later and say, I bought this fabulous thing. And then I say, yes, I know. I was the underbidder. Well, it serves me right. But I was glad to show you that. I'm sorry it's more Sheffield plate. We seem to have been doing Sheffield plate for a while. I'll stop now, I promise. But as I say, it's as and when these things come up. So I don't know what we'll be talking about next week. Possibly nothing at all if nothing turns up, but fingers crossed. Until then, goodbye and good antiques hunting.